Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. We're joined today by Dr. Sanam Vakil, who will discuss Iran's security policy under President Raisi. In this lecture, Dr. Vakil will trace the evolution of Iran's security policy in order to explain the Raisi administration's agenda, drawing on historical experiences, threat perceptions, and domestic and international security dynamics. Sanam will explain the worldview that the Raisi administration brings to the table that mix paranoia and pride and Iran's shifting foreign and security policies. Sanam Vakil is a renowned expert on the topic from whom I, over the years, have learned a great deal. She is the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa Program at Chatham House, where she leads projects on Iran and Gulf Arab dynamics. Her research focuses on regional security, Gulf geopolitics, and on future trends on Iran's domestic and foreign policies. She's also the James Anderson Professional Lecturer in Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. Sanam, thank you so much for joining us for this lecture. Before we get started, I just want to remind the audience that they can submit their questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom or by commenting on the live stream posts of the Arab Center's social media platforms. Sanam, thank you so much for being with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mehran. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today, and that was an overly generous introduction. It is rather that I have been learning from you, so thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work that you have done and contributed to my understanding and the broader understanding of Iranian domestic and foreign policy. I thought I would try and explain the current context of Iran's security position by reflecting a bit more on where we have been and to consider the worldview of Iran's conservative politicians. I think thinking about different worldviews is particularly important in the context of tensions in the Middle East, where there remain big gaps and misunderstandings among states, among non-state actors, and among individual policymakers and political leaders. I think it's really critical to understand the thinking of all of these different individuals and factors to better accept, to predict policy and strategy from states, but in this context, from the Islamic Republic. I think more often than not, we hear and we continue to see the Islamic Republic as a revolutionary, revisionist state. And I have to say that through my study and continued examination of the Islamic Republic, I am beginning to see the Islamic Republic as more of a status quo power. It has been in power for 43 years. And as it has survived, perhaps not thrived, but survived what it sees as multiple threats, and been able to push back against security challenges, perhaps we might be able to see and understand predictive patterns of behavior in the Islamic Republic. And in understanding those patterns that will perhaps open doors and help us try to unlock some of the misperceptions and security dilemmas that continue to very much haunt and impact regional security, not just in the context of Iran, but more broadly in the region. And as many states, particularly in the Gulf Arab side, continue to struggle to understand the Islamic Republic, I think thinking about the worldview and perception from Tehran is critical to perhaps address Tehran's security dilemmas, as is the reverse, considering the security and worldview of different states on the other side of the Gulf as well. So this is very much how I try to think and inform my understanding of regional security, Iran's security challenges, as well as security challenges from the perception of other states. There are diverse factors that shape state behavior. And I think IR theory is going through a reckoning of its own in the context of the devastating war in Ukraine. But much of my thinking, of course, is formed by the realist and neo-realist schools. And you might see my application of Ken Walt's theory of the man, the state, and the environment coming out a little bit in the way I think about the Islamic Republic. But I see Iran's security policy, particularly by the conservative political establishment that remains at the helm of the Iranian state, the Raisi government's victory in the president election just last year, formalized conservative monopoly of elected institutions as well as unelected institutions. And while factionalism is a prominent feature of Iranian politics, and it is a prominent feature of Iranian conservative politics, conservatives in general, and again, I'm just for the purposes of this discussion trying to keep it simple, have a particular worldview that I think we have to understand. And this is formed by perspectives of Iran's history, experiences in recent events over the past number of decades, obviously the ideology of key figures inside Iran, such as Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, the supreme leader. So this individual thinking also very much matters. And I think taken together, I see a mix of nationalism and paranoia as very much coming together in how Iran engages in the international domain and in the regional domain. And understanding this mix of paranoia and nationalism is important because Iran sees its activities in the region of the Middle East as defensive, while regional states in the Middle East rightly see Iran's incursions and activities as aggressive and offensive. And this mismatch is the essential sort of divide in understanding and sort of arriving at some sort of solution. How do you deal with a defensive posture and policy, address a country's security concerns that on the other side are aggressive and offensive? So finding solutions to this policy dilemma, I think, is the real crux to address regional security issues, which is on the agenda of all international governments today, as the nuclear talks in Vienna remain inconclusive. And regional states from Tehran to Abu Dhabi to Israel to Saudi Arabia, just to name a few, are deeply concerned that without a JCPOA, regional tensions will unravel, and with a JCPOA, tensions will also unravel. So considering these security challenges remain, I think, ever urgent. So let's focus on my exam question or my assignment today, and let me sort of shed some light on my thinking about Iranian history, events, ideology, and individual thinking in the Islamic Republic. Ultimately, I think the conservative-minded elites in Iran are very much formed and influenced by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has been supreme leader since 1989. And his thinking is indeed defensive. And his thinking has very much over 3 decades trickled down and impacted those close to him, and of course have helped drive Iranian decision making over this period of time. I think the primary objective of the state through this period has been to protect the security and the stability of the Islamic Republic. So I think it's important to establish that going forward. And the primary threat perceptions of the state, moving away from the individual, is that the role of the United States in the region and vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic is seen to be aggressive and deleterious to Iran's security and stability. Israel, by virtue of its relationship in the region, is also seen as a security threat for the Islamic Republic. So over the course of the past 4 decades and continuing today, the goal of the Islamic Republic has been to reduce, weaken, and push out the role of the United States in the Middle East. And how has the Islamic Republic executed these goals? And of course, it hasn't fully achieved these goals, but has made some advances. And this, of course, has also impacted Iran's worldview. It has relied on deterrence, and it's relied on a strategy known as forward defense to create what it has, I think, quite effectively achieved: strategic depth. It has pushed its perceived threats, and it's important to say perceived because those threats are threats that Tehran sees as threats. I don't necessarily see them as threats, but it pushes its perceived threats away from the borders of the Islamic Republic and pushes them close to other arenas where it has identified threats to the Islamic Republic. It has been most effective at pushing threats closer to the borders of Israel, around areas where the United States has American bases in Iraq. And more recently, over the past decade, it has developed ties with Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, pushing itself onto the Saudi border. So regionally, it has used this strategy in order to get closer to these perceived threats and push those threats again away from Iran's closer territory. And this in Tehran has been seen to be an effective strategy. It doesn't mean that the Islamic Republic hasn't tried its hand or tried to pursue other patterns, other policies over the past number of decades. In fact, it very much has tried to engage with the West. It has cooperated with the US forces in the Afghan war in 2001, just to name one example. It engaged in the JCPOA negotiations in well before 2015, but it signed the JCPOA with the United States in 2015 as just another example. And of course, there's a long laundry list we can point to, and that is often pointed to in Tehran. But from the perception of policymakers in Iran, a defensive perception, those events of outreach didn't translate to changes in Iran's security. In fact, those events of outreach actually made Iran more vulnerable. The Afghan war and then the war in Iraq brought, of course, US troops to Iran's borders. And while Iran did benefit from the removal of the Taliban, a longtime enemy of the Islamic Republic, and from Saddam Hussein, Iran had to contend with a new security challenge on its borders, and that was the presence of the United States. Additionally, with the JCPOA, that was supported again inside Iran, and it was even, to a certain degree, supported by Iran's suspicious, very cautious supreme leader in 2015. It was done so in a very careful way. And the deal in Tehran was seen to be transactional. It was, very much pushed and supported by Iran's pragmatic and... Did you lose me?
Just after the push was transactional and pragmatic.
Okay, apologies for that. Internet.
I think it was our internet, so you're okay, but it was
okay.
our
well, trust me,
on our side. I apologize.
The internet in London is also unreliable.
But it could also be the opponents of the JCPOA
yes.
side.
Yes, very much so. The ones in Tehran. But so the JCPOA, the experiment of the JCPOA, which saw the US government and Donald Trump impose maximum pressure on Iran, the takeaway from that experience was also seen to be quite negative. And in fact, brought Iran under immense economic pressure that has been considered to tantamount to economic warfare by the US on the Islamic Republic. So I think these are just two, and there are many more examples that sort of reflect Iranian effort and outreach that have in the past been rebuffed. And there, I think, is a sense in Iran that no matter what the Islamic Republic does, that goodwill does not beget goodwill. And this is sort of playing on a quote of George Bush Sr., who in the early 90s offered an outreach to Iran and offered this sort of olive branch of goodwill begets goodwill. But from the Iranian worldview and perception, that goodwill has never. On top of that, I think that there has been a sort of reflection and a consideration that the dynamics in the region have, of course, very much shifted and evolved. Over this 4-decade period, the Islamic Republic has in fact seen a decline, or it sees the US in decline, a weakening of the US influence in the region. There has, of course, been tangible US retrenchment from Iraq, initially under the Obama administration. It did come back, of course, and cooperated pragmatically again with the Islamic Republic to counter ISIS. But there has been an understanding that US domestic dynamics in the United States are sort of necessitating this push for the US to prioritize domestic and geopolitical issues. There has been the dramatic departure of the US last summer from Afghanistan that has also been witnessed in Tehran as well. There have been other examples, again, in the Gulf, where the US has flip-flopped or not come forward adequately, let's say, to defend even Gulf Arab security interests in the past. And Iran has been acutely aware of that. And I think one particular turning point has been the 2019 attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, for example. So in the arc of, I think, of Iranian analysis, they do see that their longer term objectives of reducing America's influence in the region is actually coming to fruition. So this has been a positive as well. And in the context of that, they also have seen, I think more broadly, the US, let's say, not coming to defend some of its longstanding allies during the Arab Spring protests, particularly in Egypt. And as that was perceived to be quite negative among American partners, particularly Saudi Arabia, for example, Iran took that on board as well, very cognizant of the shifts in the international and regional environment as well. And I think this has very much impacted the worldview and thinking, and helped Iran to see that this strategy of strategic depth is one that can be maintained in the context of the changing region. More broadly, though, I would say there have been other shifts that have also impacted Iran. I would say most prominently, two events have been important in impacting the worldview of Iranian conservatives. That, of course, is the Iran-Iraq War, where Iran survived despite being completely encircled without any meaningful allies. And that sense of survival has very much fueled a sense of paranoia, but also a sense of pride. And I think channeling and understanding that sense of pride is really important. Again, I try to think about it because, this was, I think, a very key moment where there was no expectation that the Islamic Republic would survive this war, and it did. And the fact that it did, despite everything, has fueled a sense of thinking in Tehran that I think is really critical to understanding individuals, but also state survival instincts. And that survival instinct, again, kicked into high gear during maximum pressure. And this sense of survival, despite the odds, I think is really key. Iran has been under sanctions for 43 years. Iran has been under the threat of regime change for 43 years. US governments of various political leanings have always repeated the refrain of all options are on the table. And we know very well that most individuals and states would like to see a more rational, a more democratic, a transformed Islamic Republic. And so they are not wrong that people would like to see a different Islamic Republic. In Iran, that is perceived to be regime change. And very much conservatives see that as forming this thinking of a jang-e-narm, a soft war against the Islamic Republic, a desire to change the Islamic Republic's composition from within, where there would be a coup from within or uprising from within. And so in the context of domestic political challenges, whether that has been in 1999 during student protests, in 2009 during the Green Movement protests, or in any year of the Islamic Republic's history, where it has a pattern of protests that is slightly unprecedented in the Middle East, but particularly in 2017, during those protests, or again in 2019 when the protests spread again throughout Iran. This, of course, has raised Iran's security concerns as well, being very cognizant that Western countries, and particularly the United States, would like to foment and facilitate a change of the Islamic Republic, not from just external pressure, but from internal pressure. And this can be connected also to how the Islamic Republic, and I think particularly Ali Khamenei, sees the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he has been in his writing and in his statements since coming to power 3 decades ago, made repeated reference to the collapse of the Soviet Union as being an important turning point event, and how the system should try to prevent that similar collapse in Iran. And so what very much guides Iran ideologically has been this idea of resistance. Of course, there's a notion of Islamic resistance attached to resistance, but I think that there is an anti-American resistance attached to resistance. And it's very much associated and applied to the axis of resistance, where Iran has created an arc of relationships that are linked together, not necessarily by their Islamic orientation or their sectarian affiliation, but rather than a shared worldview of resistance. And that has held Iran together in sort of standing up to the West, standing up to the United States, and in pursuing this ideology of independence, of neither East nor West, which of course isn't perfectly applied every day in every single way. And we know that Iran is tilting closer to Eastern states, particularly Russia and China. But this is really what holds the Islamic Republic's ideological narrative together. And taking it back just quickly as I wrap up, in thinking about where the Islamic Republic is going, and particularly the Raisi administration is going. Yes, the Islamic Republic was yet again pursuing the revival of the JCPOA. That revival of the deal, I think, should be seen again in terms of pragmatic aims, transactional aims, not transformational aims. And I think that should be one of the big sort of takeaways and lessons learned. This is not a system that is seeking to evolve. It is seeking to survive and eventually to benefit economically. So Khamenei, in 2015 said, no deal is better than a bad deal. And this still remains, I think, the guiding framework for the way Iran is negotiating again today. Khamenei, over 3 decades, has pushed policies of independence and self-sufficiency. And in fact, Iran continues to invest in its resistance economy, which isn't creating 8 or 10% growth, but it has led Iran out of a recession with about 2% growth rate a year. So this survival model, defensive model, is where the Islamic Republic is investing as well. Finally, it very much sees the survival of the regime as connected to limited Western engagement because of the paranoia and because of the potentially legitimate sense that Western countries would like to see a changed Iran, would like to influence Iran from within. They are unlikely to pursue huge domestic reforms, huge social reforms, because they very much see that Soviet model of perestroika and then glasnost as having weakened the Soviet Union, and see that very much likely to weaken the Islamic Republic. Doesn't mean that those changes can't come in the future, but in the current context, particularly of a paranoid security worldview, this is guiding policy decision making going forward. So as the Raisi administration approaches the region and considers its security dilemmas, a JCPOA could be beneficial. In fact, it would give perhaps the Islamic Republic economic relief and confidence to invest in the domestic economy. It would give the Islamic Republic an opportunity to perhaps rebuild some lost legitimacy with its population. But at the same time, it's not 100% necessary, because this is a system that has also effectively learned to manage and contain domestic threats. And I would even argue that they have a pattern of containment of this domestic threats that is also relatively predictable if we watch how protests occur, spread, and then are eventually extinguished in Iran. The Raisi administration, however, one area where they have been quite clear that they seek to sort of shift engagement is on regional issues. And this is an administration, I think, that would like to prioritize an improvement of regional relations. And this shift perhaps can only be pursued through a JCPOA and a continuation of bilateral and multilateral dialogue with regional states. But there has been a recognition, particularly through maximum pressure, that it's Iran's regional relationships, both with the axis of resistance partners, but also with regional states around Iran's borders, that Iran was able to survive. And Iran has relied on political, but also economic relationships and forged and invested in those relationships to help its economy through this period. And I think that has formed perhaps a new thinking that investing in a broader regional improvement in Iran's regional relations could ultimately be one of the ways that Iran can address and reduce some of its security challenges in the region. I will just end by saying one additional point. So, there is an assumption, or there is a hope that ultimately what we need to be focusing on, or what Western policymakers need to be focusing on, is not as much Iran's nuclear challenge, but actually regional presence, regional support for proxy groups, the proliferation of lethal aid. And in the context of everything I presented, I'm effectively saying that the Islamic Republic is not going to be very forward thinking and looking and addressing these issues. And I think that regional states perhaps are aware of this. But Khamenei just the other day also said that Iran will not reduce its defensive power. So just in 2022, he again referred to Iran as a defensive state. And he said that Iran's regional presence gives us strategic depth and more power. So we should expect greater investment in Iran's regional environment, greater investment in the relationships that carried Iran through this period of economic warfare and maximum pressure, and understand that there is a sense of hubris, pride, and resilience attached to Iran's ability to survive all of this pressure and be able to execute a strategy amid what it sees as encirclement and ultimately containment of the Islamic Republic. So I'll stop there. I think I overspoke my time, and I apologize. But I'm looking forward to the discussion with you, Mehran.
This was absolutely fantastic and brilliant, Sanam. Thank you so very much. I think only you could, in such a concise and digestible manner, explain something so complicated and do so persuasively and insightfully. Thank you so much. This is terrific. There are several questions that have come to us on social media, and I also wanted to add a couple of things. One of the things you mentioned is the legacy of the Iran-Iraq war, and the paranoia and pride that is rooted in that experience, along with what Tehran sees as a series of bitter experiences when they have expended political capital in making nice, basically, to the Americans in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and JCPOA, and being then rebuffed for it, or not necessarily getting the return on investment, on the political investment that they have put into it. To what extent is there consistency in Iran's in these developments informing Iranian strategic and foreign policy thinking from one administration to another? Based on what you said, it strikes me that there's remarkable consistency, whether it's Rouhani or Raisi or Foreign Minister Zarif versus Amir Abdullahian. If you could elaborate on that.
Sure, thank you. I think that's an important point to sort of break apart. I do think that there has been consistency. I think that there perhaps have been tactical differences between administrations, but let's break apart where they have been consistent and where they haven't. I think there is a consistency in the strategic objective of survival. And I think there's a strategic consistency in the objective of not just survival, but also in this worldview that many Western states are seeking to change the nature of the Islamic Republic. The difference, I think, perhaps between President Rouhani and a President Raisi, and I'm not sure I would even put them in the same category, because President Rouhani really had a broader degree of foreign policy experience than President Raisi. But I think the difference is that, tactically speaking, President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif thought the pathway to protecting the Islamic Republic was through economic engagement and international integration. Whereas conservatives and hardliners, again, with their suspicious, paranoid worldview, see that strategy or that tactic of international integration would ultimately unseat the Islamic Republic and their place with it from within. And so I think that the Supreme Leader allowed for both strategies to be executed simultaneously, as a test case to see which one would work for the Islamic Republic. And very clearly, as an outcome of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, I think one of the principal takeaways is that the economic engagement pathway, at least in the one that relies on the West, is not a sustainable policy for the Islamic Republic, because ultimately the enmity, the suspicion, and the objectives of Western states towards the Islamic Republic hasn't changed, and thereby there will be that jang in arm, and that jang in arm is going to ultimately unseat hardliners and conservatives from within the state. So they are also seeking to protect their own place within the political system.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question that deals more with contemporary developments, and that is Russia's role in the Vienna talks. As you know, today, Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian is in Moscow and has had a meeting with Lavrov and his team. What is Russia up to? And is it playing the role of a spoiler?
Well, yes, this has definitely been an interesting development, one that I think many of the JCPOA negotiators didn't foresee and prepare for, but Russia, I think, has decided to hold the nuclear negotiations hostage, requiring written demands that its economic engagement with the Islamic Republic be protected. And this is important, obviously, because Russia is under its own version of maximum pressure sanctions. And so, maintaining its trade relationship with Iran could be useful in the future. Iran has definitely not got a huge level of trade with Russia. It's about $4 billion a year. So it's not really about Iran, but rather access to the Iranian market, what it could do in the Iranian market to sanctions bust, perhaps. The Iranians have themselves become quite effective sanctions busters and have developed perhaps a whole sanctions busting policy that could be shared with the Russians going forward. But ultimately, I mean, this is more symbolic. It is using a sort of shared security challenge that of Iran's nuclear program in order to exert influence and pressure and perhaps create another crisis for Western states. And Tehran. So first of all, legally, Russia's support for the JCPOA and the Joint Commission is necessary for the deal to go forward. But secondly, I don't see it very likely that Tehran will be able to work around or ignore Russia's demands in the context of of Iranian security and Iranian partnerships. Russia and Tehran have had a pragmatic relationship for a number of years. It doesn't mean that there haven't been tensions between the two states. And of course, Iran has had a long history of tensions with Russia going back to the 19th century. I mean, the Treaty of Turcomanchi is tossed around quite regularly, I think, in the Iranian press as a reminder of negative past history. But in considering the multipolar world, in considering U.S. retrenchment from the region, Iran and Iranian conservatives very much see Russia and a relationship with Russia and also China as important to protect and shield Iran from security challenges that would come from Western states. So it's going to definitely be interesting to see how this plays out. And you'll have already had noticed that the Iranian spokesperson has already stated that, well, it's not just external factors that have impeded the talks. There are still challenges within the deal itself. So perhaps they're preparing the terrain because they know that there are not many workarounds that can be found to address this really serious issue, quite frankly.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a question about the changes in Iran's foreign policy under Raisi in relation to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, particularly in light of the fact that Iran was or has opened some diplomatic channels to the UAE, and although they've just been postponed, to Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, the Houthis have been attacking both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes. The Saudi-Iran talks, I think, are a reflection, of course, of period. They have come after both sides have experienced perhaps economic challenges, political challenges. So this was an opportunity to dial down tensions. And from the Iranian side, improving regional relations has been a priority under the Rouhani administration. But I think that Arab Gulf states are somewhat comforted by the conservative unity that they see within Iran's system. And there is a greater sense that when they engage with an Iranian president, they're engaging with a political leader or interlocutor that has the ear of Iran's supreme leader. And they see Iranian decision-making as perhaps not necessarily reflective of the reality, but similar to their own systems where decisions are primarily made at the top, rather than the reality, which is much more consensus-based. So these talks come in the context of change of administration, perhaps a period of retrenchment. The problem is that these talks have hit a number of walls, and they've hit a number of walls because of the structural imbalance between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this is connected to threat perceptions and worldviews. Tehran does not see Saudi Arabia as a primary security threat. Tehran's threat perceptions, as I mentioned, come from Western states, and particularly the United States, whereas Saudi Arabia sees Iran as its number one security threat. And for these two states to address these issues actually requires, I think, and what I've always argued, the linking of the JCPOA to broader regional dynamics. Because for Iran's security challenges to be addressed, they have to be managed from an external actor, whereas for Saudi Arabia's security challenges to be addressed, it requires concessions from Iran. But for Iran to make those concessions, it will need something in a broader theater. And you can see that this is three-dimensional chess and hard to make simple, but ultimately, Iran isn't going to offer let's say in an ideal world, a reduction of ties with the Houthis without receiving something significant in return. And the question is, what is it that Saudi Arabia can offer Iran that is adequate for such a shift in its policy? I would just add one more point. It's very important, actually, for both sides to understand and respect the worldview of each other and understand and respect each other's security concerns to arrive at perhaps a solution. And so maybe while they were at a brief moment of a mutual hurting stalemate, I don't think that either country has enough understanding or respect of security concerns or each other's worldview yet to make progress on the bilateral security challenges that they both face. And so that's why so quickly the talks have been postponed. And this is, obviously goes beyond the executions that took place in Saudi Arabia, but are connected to the pause in the Vienna talks and broader Saudi concerns vis-a-vis the United States as well.
Am I correct in assuming that in addition to those, the Iranians were also reacting to the Arab League statement against Iran that the Saudis spearheaded?
Yes, of course. I mean, and the level of complication and sort of bringing and explaining all of these issues, I think has become even harder for us analysts, but absolutely, that is also a sort of driver of where we are and these new dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. We're quickly running out of time, and you've been so kind and generous with your time. So I'll ask these quickly, and if you can keep your answers also quickly. Can you elaborate on the government bodies and institutions that are responsible for security policy, and do domestic and external security policies align? This is one question. And another question asks if you think Iran's security threat is foremost from Israel or from the United States, can the two be decoupled? The threat coming from the U.S. versus threat from Israel.
Thank you. On the first one, I think the primary and most important body in the foreign policy apparatus is the Supreme National Security Council. It brings together all critical individuals from around from the system, both elected individuals and unelected individuals, and their recommendations are made and provided to the Supreme Leader. I think that these are sort of strategic decisions that are taken tactically. They're executed through the Supreme National Security Council. And that's why Ali Shamkhani, for example, is watched so closely around the region, as he's seen to be a very important interlocutor. I do think that domestic and a broader security are linked. And this is seen in how Iran very much has tried to push back against regional interference, or what it sees to be regional or U.S. interference in its domestic politics. This can be obviously through rhetoric coming from abroad, but also through funds or financing for groups inside. There has been a higher degree of repression and pushback against civil society, NGOs, journalism training, all of those efforts that could be coming from abroad to help promote greater cohesion, if not organized movements within the Iranian political system. So that also impacts how Iran sees Western infiltration and Western objectives of transformation. And we've also seen, obviously, Israel be quite adept at making forays into the Iranian domestic population, and we could also perhaps go so far as to say into the security apparatus, because of a lot of what Israel has achieved inside Iran couldn't simply been done through accessing ordinary Iranians. I think the last question is a really important one on Israel and the United States, and if those can be decoupled. I think it's very hard to decouple them, really, because of U.S. Security ties with Israel, U.S. connection with Israel. Of course, there are changing dynamics in the United States, and a bit more of a more nuanced engagement with regards to Israel, but I don't think they can really be separated. What really ultimately is needed is, in an ideal world, for maybe a next generation of Iranian leaders to see things differently. I used the word perceived threats earlier, and these are perceived threats in Tehran. If those perceptions change towards Israel or the United States, then these policies could change. But I'm not very optimistic that there will be changes, because obviously both the state and individuals have been impacted by 43 years of patterns that continue to repeat, if not, rhyme. And many of the up and coming younger generation of Iranian policymakers have grown up in this system, have been educated in this system, and don't have the level of interaction or engagement with the international community. And so the worldview remains ever embedded and nurtured within that system. And I think that is going to pose a longer term challenge.
Thank you. Sanam, a couple of days ago, Israel hit an Iranian base in Syria, and 2 IRGC soldiers were killed. And so in retaliation, yesterday, Iran hit a building in Erbil. And today, the New York Times is reporting that indeed that building was used by Israelis for training purposes. And also yesterday, or late last night, there was a massive internet outage in Israel. And in fact, the Israeli Internet or Cyber Directorate declared a state of emergency, and all fingers were pointed to Iran. Previously, when Iranian positions in Syria were hit, the Iranians would say, we would take revenge at our own time, and sometimes that revenge would never come. But now we see kind of an almost immediate reaction and a very massive and seemingly effective reaction. Is this a reflection of newfound confidence, or how would one explain this Iranian willingness to retaliate and do so kind of with such force?
I think that within the Islamic Republic, because we've also seen patterns of infiltration and sabotage against Iranian nuclear facilities at Natanz, the killing of nuclear scientists even years ago, but more recently, killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, for example. The Islamic Republic, I think the security-minded establishment made a decision that for every time Israel directly attacked Iran, they would have to push back. And the Islamic Republic has identified, I guess, a variety of different pathways to push back. It has attacked, in every time the nuclear facilities are attacked, Iran accelerated its nuclear program, thereby, in a way, pushing back against Israel's objectives at constraining Iran's nuclear program. And now they're taking this strategy, I think, and implementing it more brazenly. And it's, of course, more dangerous in in the region. Israel, of course, has also directly attacked Iran in the cyber facility, in the cyber domain. I mean, even a few months ago, Iranian petrol stations were attacked with a funny message like, call the Supreme Leader's office. So, you know, both sides are very much upping the ante, I think, in a dangerous way. But the attack in Erbil, it definitely seems to be a much more aggressive, but I think it's aggressive in the context of where we are in the region. We seem to be in a moment of flux, and I think that Tehran wants to send very strong and clear signals of what the red lines are for Tehran. And that no state in the region should use this moment of flux as an opportunity to go after Iran. Iran is definitely going to start to also push back more directly, I think, and that's one of my takeaways of the attack that we saw over the weekend.
Perfect. May I ask one last question? I promise it's the last one. And the last question has to do with the war in Ukraine, particularly in light of Iran's Look East policy. What is Iran's position in this war?
This has been an interesting one to watch because, of course, Iran has very clearly shifted from being particularly independent or neutral as a state, and shifted to more alignment with Eastern states, Russia and China in particular. But this war has resulted Iran in the vote at the UN abstained, much to the surprise of many in the international community. I think it's a reflection of Iran taking a neutral posture. There's domestic opposition to the war, and sometimes that domestic opposition is important to factor. Russia also supported a condemnation of or supported a UN resolution against the Houthis in Yemen. And it's quite interesting that, again, the Iranian Foreign Ministry explained its abstention in the public domain. I think, quite frankly speaking, that neutral posture is Iran not hedging its bets, but trying to reorient itself to independence. We shouldn't expect Iran to take a pro-US or pro-Western position, but considering, again, its history, considering, again, its worldview, an abstention sort of makes sense in this fluctuating moment of regional security, and this sort of sends multiple messages simultaneously, both domestically, regionally, and internationally.
Perfect. Thank you. You mentioned hedging, and one of the interesting things I discovered was that before his trip to Moscow, the foreign minister, Amir Abdullahian, had a phone conversation with his Ukrainian counterpart. And I found that quite interesting on Iran's part. We're going to Moscow, but we haven't forgotten you guys either. And I thought that was interesting. Sanam, you've been so terrific. You've given us an incredible view of this very complicated dynamic. You're very generous with your expertise and your time. And on behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, the Iranian Studies Unit here, and our audiences here in Doha and around the world, I am most grateful to you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me, Mehran. It was good to be here with you.
Thank you. I hope you do come back when there's greater stability and less conflict in the Middle East, and we can have a follow-up conversation.
And less hedging.
Less hedging. Less hedging. Thank you so much, Sanam. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.